these so-called secular composers, secular writers. Speaking of which, so my mother had a favorite lullaby, and that lullaby was Bashad of Bethlehem, in the fields of Bethlehem. It's got a melody to die for, and the lyrics are beautiful. In the fields of Bethlehem, on the way to Ephrat, upon an ancient grave stands a tomb, and with the coming of midnight, on the path of her weariness, a beautiful woman rises. Leaving her grave, she marches silently eastward towards the river Jordan, silently marching. The lyrics are by Abba Konstantin Shapira. I want you to hear me. Konstantin Shapira was born in Russia, a Jew, and then was rejected by his father when he wanted to become an artist. He was a photographer and he wanted to be a poet. As a result of that, he left the yeshiva, left Orthodoxy completely, went away, married a Gentile woman, and then when he became terribly ill under her influence, he converted to Christianity. This was written after the conversion. All of his songs and his poems that are soaked with love of Eretz Yisrael are written after his conversion. This too was the tragedy of the Golah, of the exile, that we don't talk about very much. We don't talk about life conditions, about the inability to get a job, the inability to be respected, the inability to eat sometimes, the inability to receive medical care. And so here is this iconic early Israeli song, my mother's favorite lullaby. My grandfather used to sing her to sleep with this sad, sad song. And so here it is. בשדמות בית-לחם, בדרך אפרתה, בדרך אפרתה. עלי קבר קדומים תעמוד מצבת, תעמוד מצבת. וכבוא חצות לילה בדרך יפתה, תעלה יפת מראה ואת קברה עוזבת, לירדן מזרחה דומם צועדת, דומם צועדת. All this music that we've heard until now, Russian and some German influences. All of it. All those composers went to music academies in Russia. Some of them went in Ukraine, a few of them in Germany. But there was another sound happening in Eretz Yisrael. Something very different, something not exilic, something that sounded unique to the land of Israel. And we hear different music suddenly. It's coming very, very quickly on the heels of the music I just sang for you. This is still late 30s, early 40s. עלי גבעה שם בגליל יושב שומר ובפיו חליל ומחלל שירת רועה לסלע גדי לשיח טועה היו היה גיבור חידה ולא זרוע יחידה The song is about Yosef Trumpeldor, the one-armed hero, the icon of early Israeli Eretz Israel bravery, a dentist from Odessa who lost his arm in the Battle of Gallipoli, then came to the land of Israel, very charismatic man, and was killed by Arab marauders in the Galilee. It's interesting because the Arabs who we are calling marauders now lived in the Galilee. That's where they were from. They happened to be Syrian, and when Trumpeldor died, he was famed to have said, Tov lamut be'ad artzenu. He is quoting Ovid, it is good to die for one's country. We grew up on that myth, on those famous last words of Trumpeldor. It took 50 years until it was uncovered in some research that the actual words uttered by Yosef Trumpeldor as he was dying had something to do with the anatomy of the sister of the person who had just shot him. But that doesn't make for good mythology. So the question is, why do we have mythology? We have mythology because we have to have mythology. Because the idea of having a country, a nation of Jews after 2,000 years of exile was absurd. It was ridiculous. It couldn't have happened. How could you make soldiers out of people who were cowering for 2,000 years, afraid to make any waves? People who had been slaughtered, pogroms, rape, pillage, murder, burning of villages. How do you turn those people into a nation? You need myth. You need mythology. And that myth worked for as long as it did. It's not there anymore. But we need to remember it. And we need to remember it without scorn, without any cynicism about that early writing, because the early writing at that time was terribly necessary. Here's the ironic thing. The melody you just heard was a Syrian Bedouin melody. So we take a song about Trumpeldor, who was killed by Syrian Bedouins, and we set it to music by Syrian Bedouins. And here is another Bedouin melody.
Lamidbar Sainu Alde Bashad Gemalim Al Savrehem Yetzalzelu Pa'avonim Gedolim Sainu Lamidbar Sainu Sainu Lamidbar Sainu Tini li 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 Tini li 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 Tini li 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 Lamidbar Sainu Lamidbar Sainu Lamidbar Sainu.
Lyrics by Alexander Pen are very frivolous. Carry us to the desert on camelbacks. Upon their necks, great bells will chime. Tee-lee-lee-lee-lee-lee. Nothing great there. Alexander Pen was a great poet. This ain't it. This is ideal writing, idyllic writing. And who's the ideal? Think about it. Because I just sang you two songs with Bedouin melodies. The ideal for the early settlers in Israel were Bedouins. So 2,000 years we're in exile, we come back from the shtetl, and who do we adopt as our role models? Bedouins. Why? Free, proud, unencumbered, not afraid, brave, riding on horses, sometimes on camels, guns slung over their shoulders. They owe allegiance to no one. This spoke very deeply to the early settlers. And when you see the first shomrim, the first guardians in the Galil, they are dressed like Bedouins, and not accidentally. That's the ideal. And now we see these two streams of music coming together. Russian, Ukrainian, Cossack on the one hand, and suddenly from the land of Israel itself, but not Jewish either, Arab music. And those two start coming together. We will see where they lead eventually. But now we are becoming an Israeli. We are finding our own voice. And no two poets exemplify that better than Avaham Shlonsky and Natan Alterman. So here's the thing. On Shabbat noon, assuming I had behaved really well that week, which didn't happen a lot, my mother would take me to Dizengoff, and we'd walk down Dizengoff, and then we'd walk by Kassit, which was the Bohemian Cafe. And if we were lucky, Shlonsky and Alterman, the national poets, would be sitting there with their huge white, especially Shlonsky had this huge white mane of hair like a lion in the winter. And we'd wave to them and say, Shalom HaMeshorer, hi, poet. And they'd graciously tip their hats or their hand and wave back to us. Oh my God, was that a treat. My week was made for me. This was such an honor. We need to understand that in my Israel, the Israel I grew up in, being a poet or a writer was the highest you could reach. Israelis listened to poets and writers before they listened to leaders. It's still that way, not the same way, but it's still there. If Aleph Bet Yoshua speaks or Amos Oz spoke, people listened. It's just the way it is. When Nomi Shemer spoke, people listened. They mattered. Here's a poem by Avaham Shlonsky. Again, secular. Dress me, good mother, in a glorious robe of many colors, and at dawn lead me to toil. My land is wrapped in light as in a talit. The houses stand like frontlets, and the hand-paved roads stream down like straps of tefillin. Here the lovely city says the morning prayers to its creator, and among the creators is your son, Avraham, a road-paving poet of Israel. And in the evening twilight, father will return from his sorrows and, like a prayer, will whisper joyfully, my dear son Abraham, skin, sinews, and bones, hallelujah. Dress me, good mother, in a glorious robe of many colors, and at dawn lead me to labor. Just hear the Hebrew 1 second. Halbishini ima kashira kutonet pasim letiferet, ve'im shachar hovilini elei amal. עוטפה ארצי אור כטלית, ובתים ניצבו כתותפות, וכרצועות תפילין גולשים כבישים סללו כפיים. Beautiful. Even if you don't understand Hebrew, that's beautiful. The sound, the music, the rolling, and it is Israeli. It is no longer exilic. This is not written from somewhere far away. This is written in Israeli idiom. But no one does that better than Alterman. So before I'll read you something very painful by Alterman, I'll tell you a little bit about him, and then I'll point your attention to the fact that in Alterman, there is a tragic love affair with his feminine homeland. And all of his imagery and all of his poetry is always this torturous relationship between him and the feminine. And it is not pretty, but it is beautiful. It's tragic. It's painful. It's doomed. And it's beautiful. And it's unforgettable. You cannot be an Israeli of my generation without Alterman. There is no such thing. I pose to you that there is no more important literary figure than Alterman in forging a character of an Israeli in the early years. There are other poets, but Alterman stands that way ahead of everyone else.
במנוחה ליגע ומרכו עליה מל לילה חיוור משתרע על שדות עמק יזרעאל עלתה למלמטה ולבנה מעל, מבית אלפה עד נהלל. דממה לילה מליל, דממה ביזרעאל, נומה עמק ארץ תפארת, אנו לך משמרת. נומה עמק ארץ תפארת, אנו לך משמרת.
Rest has come to the weary and tranquility to the laborer. A pale night stretches out over the fields of the valley of Jezreel, dew below and a moon above from Beit Alpha to Naalal. How is this night different from any other night? Silence in Jezreel. Sleep, O valley, glorious land. We stand sentinel over you. Perfect, no? What could go wrong? What could possibly go wrong in this song? Let's get to the last verse. Darkness on Mount Gilboa. A horse gallops from shadow to shadow. A scream soars from high above, from the fields of the valley of Jezreel. Who shot and who has fallen between Beit Alpha and Nahalal? Everything with Alterman is doomed. Everything is always doomed. It's important to remember that. And yet we continue, and yet we dive into it, and yet we sing it, and yet we go in that direction. Even though we know it's doomed, we know it's tragic, but it's so beautiful. It's so beautiful. And there is a truth of Israeliness, and that is the understanding that life is ultimately tragic and oh, so beautiful, so soaked with meaning, so worthwhile. We share that with the Irish, that same understanding that life is ultimately tragic. But while we're at it, can we write some beautiful poetry? Can we sing some beautiful songs? So here is something I have to read you because it's just important. My mother laid me down at the foot of the fence, wrinkled and silent on my back, and I stared at her from below as though from a well, until she fled as one flees from a battle, and I stared at her from below as though from a well, and a moon was raised upon us like a candle. And before dawn awakened, that very night, I rose slowly, for the time had come, and returned to my mother's house like a rolling ball that returns to the foot of the kicker, and returned to my mother's house like a rolling ball, and hugged her neck with shadowy hands. From her neck, in the sight of the Almighty, she ripped me off like a leech. But when night returned, I returned like before, and this became our law. When night returns, I return like before, and she silently bows down to the gift and the burden. And the gates of her dream are wide open to me. There is no one but me in her dreams, for the love of our souls remains taut like a bow. From the day of my birth, the love of our souls remains taut and is never taken nor given. And therefore God has never removed me from my mother's crying heart, and I, detached without being weaned, was not weaned, nor will I be detached. And I, detached without being weaned, enter her home and lock the gate shut. She grew old in my jail, impoverished and shrunken, her face wrinkled like mine. Then my wee little hands enwrapped her in white, like a mother wraps the living child. And then my wee little hands enwrapped her in white, and I carried her, not telling her where to, and I laid her down at the foot of the fence, observing and silent upon her back. And she looked at me, laughing as though from a well, and a moon was raised upon us like a candle. Alterman, torturous, magnificent. The poetry in Hebrew is to die for. It's not translatable. Yehuda Michai, awesome in English, because he's an idea poet. Alterman, not so awesome in English, he's a language poet. And you lose a lot in the translation. All right. I want to move on. Here is something Beautiful, beautiful. I'll sing for you and then tell you about the writer, the poet, the music, and where it comes from.
שם הרי גולן, הושט היד וגבם, בדממה בוטחת מצבים עצור. בבדידות קורנת נם חרמון הסבא, וצינה נושבת מפסגת הצחור. שם על חוף הים יש דקל שפל צמרת, סתור שיער הדקל כתינוק שובב, שגלש למטה ובמי כנרת ישכשך רגליו. מה ירבו פרחים בחורף על הקרח, דם הכלנית וכתם הכרכום. יש ימים פי 7 אז ירוק הירק, פי 70 תכולה התכלת במרום. גם כי אברש והלך שכוח, והיה הלב למשואות זרים. איך אוכל לבגוד בך, איך אוכל לשכוח, איך אוכל לשכוח חסד נעורים. שם הרי גולן, שם הרי גולן, שם.
There, the mountains of Golan reach out and touch them. With confident silence they command, stop. With radiant loneliness, Grandfather Hermon naps, and a chill wafts from the snowy cap. There on the shore stands a palm tree, hair tossed like a naughty child who has slid down and in the waters of Kinneret dips his feet. Love this poem, love this music. Naomi Shemer wrote the music. And the lyrics are by Rachel, known just as Rachel. She's one of the iconic early poets of Israel. Tragic story. The two things she wanted in her life was to be loved and to have a child, and consequently she got neither. And then she died of tuberculosis, very young. She was a member of Kvutzat Kinneret, which was where Naomi Shemer was born. Naomi Shemer was a year old when Rachel died. How beautiful is it that your poem gets redeemed by a woman who was born on the kibbutz that exiled you when you became sick with tuberculosis? I want us to understand the fear, the terror of living at that time in the Kinneret, in the Sea of Galilee, in that region. The heat was intolerable. The land was absolutely useless for agriculture. Besides that, there was malaria. The living conditions were absolutely horrific. And yet, those people turned that place into a green, verdant Eden. You cannot overestimate the contribution of the kibbutz movement to Eretz Yisrael. Impossible. Anyone who does that is a sinner. Must not do that. We don't have to agree with the ideology. We don't have to like socialism. We don't have to like communism. That's fine. But we cannot deny the contribution culturally, let alone from every other sense of the word. We would not have an Eretz Yisrael without the kibbutz movement. This comes right from there. But I want to send you to another woman. We're getting very close to the end of my conversation. Unfortunately, I love this stuff. So here is a poem by Leah Goldberg, and then I'll tell you something about it. It's called Tel Aviv, 1935. The masts on the rooftops back then were like the masts on Columbus's ships, and every raven standing on their tips announced a different continent. And through the streets traveled the luggage of passengers, and the language of a foreign land would pierce like the blade of a cold knife on a scorching day. How could the air of the small city carry so many memories of childhood, lost loves, rooms that have emptied somewhere? In pictures darkening inside a camera, pristine winter nights turn to rainy summer nights across the sea, and darkened mornings of capital cities, and the sound of steps behind you drums a marching song of a foreign army. And it seems like, if only you turn your head, there is in the sea floats the church of your city. Floats the church of your city. She's writing about where she came from. She's writing about what she lost. We think only about Aliyah and what it means to merit to come to Eretz Israel, to finally live in your own homeland. But we forget what was left behind. All these people were immigrants, and what was left behind was rich, was deep, was beautiful, was meaningful, and it never goes away. It stays in there. It stays in Yehuda Amichai. You can't be more Israeli than Yehuda Amichai, but Germany is there in the back of his head all the time. This is the truth. This is the truth of being an Israeli. This is from Tel Aviv. I was born and raised in Tel Aviv. The building in which I lived was Rehov Arnon 11 Arnon Street. Every morning I'd go downstairs when I was 3 years old, and with other kids in the neighborhood, we'd play on the corner. Right next to my grandparents' building was another building. And at that corner stood this charming, lovely woman with her mother. And we were always touched by how respectful, how loving she was of her mother, how she'd walk with her hand in hand, and she'd give us candies. She was the sweetest lady. I was 12 years old when I was introduced to Yedidai Mirchov Arnon, my friends from Arnon Street, by the poet Leah Goldberg. That was the lady with her mother who would give us candies in Rehov Arnon Street 11. And I will finish my session with what I consider to be probably one of the most perfect songs ever written, not just in Israel, period, ever written. I love music. I'm steeped in music. I write music. I've grown up in music from all over the world. I challenge you to find a better song. Others just as good, some, but better, I don't think so. So here we are. Let me tell you what it says, and then I'll sing it to you, and then we can talk. There were nights. I remember them. I will carry them to the end of my days. On the paths between Dgania and Kinneret stood the overburdened wagon of my life. And he approached. Listen to me, my little one. I have built you a house in which to dwell. You will weave a garment for me by night, and I will drive your wagon by day. He was fair then and tall as a song. He drove wagons in the open fields, and I would weave him a garment of blue with a flower of gold. He would leave and return to me all fevered. He would carry my image before his face. Tell me, does anyone among you know where he went to and never returned? Then I wept. Then I was stunned. I still walk towards him in faraway fields. I still carry his woven garment, a garment of blue with a flower of gold. These are the memory road marks of our life in Israel, the tragedy and the beauty infusing each other, the perfect song. This is my Israel. Music and poetry that transcend in total disproportion to the country's size, all while wars are being fought. All while a country is being built, we produced more poetry, more music, more theater, more dance, more visual art than any other country in the world per capita. Think about that when you think about why you should love Israel. It's not the tech. It's not the military. It's this. This is our Yerusha. This is our glorious inheritance. Songs, poems that speak of greatness, of the truth of life.
היו לילות, אני אותם זוכרת, אני אותם עד סוף ימי אשא. במשעולים בין דגניה לכנרת עמדה עגלת חיי עמוסה, והוא ניגש, שמעי אליי קטנטונת, אני בניתי בית לשבטך, את תרקמי בערב לי כותונת, אני אנהג ביום את עגלתך. הוא היה אז בהיר וגבוה כזמר, הוא נהג עגלות לשדה הרחב, אני לא כותונת, הייתי רוקמת, כותונת של תכלת עם פרח זהב. היה הולך ושב אליי קודח, היה נושא דמותי ממול פניו, הגידו נא, היש בכם יודע, אנה זה הלך לו ולא שב. אז הייתי בוכה, אז הייתי נדהמת, בשדות רחוקים עוד הלכתי אליו, אנוכי עוד נושאת כותנתו המרוקמת, כותונת של תכלת עם פרח זהב. היו לילות, אני אותם זוכרת, אני אותם עד סוף ימי אשא.
Donnie, thank you. That was truly beautiful. Truly, truly beautiful. So before we conclude, let's talk just a bit. There's a few things I'd like to inquire and to examine together, if that's okay. I don't want to break the sexy, beautiful, loving mood.
No,
the only problem is I hate to speak prose in an evening of such beautiful poetry. But let me ask you a couple of things. So one of the comments you made, which was so, I think, beautiful and sad, was this idea that at the heart of Israeliness, at the heart of Israeli identity, is a deep sense of tragedy.
Yeah.
And you made it so beautiful that the tragedy comes as well with a powerful sense of the beauty of life, the glory, the adventure of life.
Yes.
In the poetry of Rachel, in the music
Yes.
of Alterman, but the deep tragic nature of life, the tragic nature of the world. The beautiful sadness of the young poet who dies, on the banks of the Kinneret and is buried there.
Yeah.
Well before their time.
And buried next to Naomi Shemer. The graves are so close to each other.
Yes, I've been to that cemetery, by
Yes.
the way, and it's an astonishing cemetery.
Yes, I've
who's
sung there.
It's glorious and
Yes.
fascinating and powerful. So for everybody, you go to Israel, you go to Tiberias, you go to just above, just
Turn
next
right.
to the canyon. Yeah, you turn right. It's at the bottom of the lake and of the sea, and it's the Tiberias, the Kinneret Cemetery. On the other hand, let me ask you this. At the other hand, the anthem of the country is Hatikva,
Right.
hope.
Hope.
And hope is the counterpoint, the contrapuntal theme to the
Yes.
tragedy. So
Yes.
talk to me about hope as a contrapuntal theme to tragedy?
Wow. Well, first of all, let's remind ourselves that Naftali Herz Imber, who wrote Hatikva, was not Israeli. If he were Israeli, he wouldn't have written Hatikva. So he would have written something else. But, maybe Yerushalayim Shel Zahav. Who knows? But yes, always hope. And it's there in Chernichovsky. I believe in the future, even if it's going to be delayed, even if it comes late, I still believe in it. In other words, the marching orders are hope. Those are the marching orders. Hope. Well, hope, first of all, that I won't get killed when I'm 18. There's one hope. Hope that nobody I love dies. Hope that all of this will work. Hope that the earth shall give indeed its bounty. Hope in love, with the acknowledgement that on the road to hope, I will encounter tragedy. They are not divorced from each other. They actually belong together. Hope without tragedy, to me, is not something I can relate to. It's something that comes from a place of no strife, a place of no danger. That's not where I grew up in. Where I grew up in Sahala, Transjordan, as it was called in those days, you could see from my window. Already. So danger was there. Those things go together. Israelis are very hopeful people. Al tidag, don't be worried. What do you mean don't be? First of all, anytime an Israeli tells you al tidag, worry, okay? If they tell you not to worry, you should worry. Something is probably terribly wrong. Otherwise, they wouldn't tell you not to worry. It's a mantra that we have to chant to ourselves. Otherwise, no, quo vadis domini, where are we going? So that's my take on hope and tragedy.
And where do you get the Yeh Tov?
Right. So
it'll work out. Yeh Beseder.
Yeh Tov. Right. Yeh Tov.
This, there. We'll get.
Because what? Pogroms, crusades, exiles, Nazis, you name it. And b'chol zot, here we are. Af al pi chen, in spite of all of that, here we are. So there is hope. So we understand that the hope sometimes rises from ashes. We get that. But it's still about hope. It's still about going towards. We are constantly going towards ha'aretz ha'muvtachat, towards the promised land. We don't reach there ever. That's why Moshe never enters. Moshe doesn't enter because he's punished by some petty god. He doesn't enter because, as Rabbi Chaim Vital said, ma'alato shel Moshe gdola mi ma'alat Eretz HaKodesh. Moses' virtue is greater than the promised land. The promised land is a way, is a station. It's a place in which we are supposed to perfect ourselves, to be worthy of the inheritance. It's not a final destination. And so it's a constant march towards, keep on walking towards. V'haya ki tavo'u. And it should be when you come to the land, and then when the land shall give. If you do, then it will. It's always in future tense. It's always in future tense. And so as an Israeli, I'm completely soaked in the future. I live for that future. I live for a time when indeed nation to nation shall carry peace. Look, my father volunteered for Israel's War of Independence. My father, Norwegian Lutheran, right, was a bomb formation leader, a captain in the American Air Force, a B-26 pilot. Is recruited by the Haganah in Columbia University in 1948, didn't know any Jews, had nothing to do with the land of Israel, didn't know about the land of Israel. But he heard that he was told there were 40 million Arabs and 600,000 Jews. And my father said, I have always abhorred asymmetry. And so my father came. And my father stayed, and my father met my mother, and my father converted to Judaism, and my father became a squadron commander in the Israeli Air Force, and then a pilot for Al Anarkia. He stayed. He believed in Eretz Yisrael. He believed in the Bible in the real Eretz Israel, as Reb Nachman Abatzov said, Zo haaretz mamash al avanea ubatea, this actual land with its actual homes and actual stones. That's what my father believed in. That's why my grandparents made Aliyah to Eretz Israel in 34. My grandfather was the first JTS graduate to make Aliyah to Eretz Israel, and then started translating all of Shakespeare and Chaucer and Beowulf into Hebrew. Hope. Yes.
So let's focus on one piece of that, because I think there's something very important that you've talked about, but I want to focus on it again. And in so many ways, your own biography is an example of this, which is that Israel is at the same time the continuity of Jewish history and a rebellion against Jewish history.
Yes.
And that these songs, these poems, like you pointed out, Chernyakhovsky, the most secular Jew who ever lived, a Hellenist, right?
Yeah.
In so many of, they are so connected to their
Yes.
Jewishness and to their Jewish background and to their Jewish, and then at the same time, they are shoving it away. They want something completely new and rebellious. Talk
Yes.
about that.
Yes, Yofi. And most of the things, even next week when I shift to another period, and because I really didn't talk about war in this way, if you noticed. How can you not talk about war? But I will next time. But also about humor, about funny stuff, about cool stuff, about what Israel becomes. But here's the thing. Look, if you do not know where you come from, you do not know where you are, let alone do you know where you're going to. I don't know how many times an old person can chant that mantra to a young person, but it is know who you are or you're lost. All these poets and all these writers knew exactly who they were. Now, what they didn't like was the form. It was not the content that they rebelled against. It was the form they were rebelling against. Bialik didn't rebel really against Judaism. He rebelled against Orthodox yeshiva as it was taught at that time in Belarus and Lithuania. Many people did, and for many good reasons. But his entire my entire frame of reference as a kid in Israel was, every time, me'az yatsa matok, we'd say, like something sweet comes from something bitter. Well, that's from the book of Judges. That's from Samson. All the time we'd quote Bible nonstop as secular kids in Israel. Why? Because you can't say, this is my land, but not know Bible. Gewalt, you're using the Bible as your claim in court for your ownership on the land, for your belonging to the land. You can't then not know it. You can't then go, oh, but I have nothing to do with the Bible. If you have nothing to do with the Bible, go ahead, go to Brussels. It's lovely. I love Brussels. Very good food there. Holland is beautiful. I love England. You're going to be in Israel. Israel, I'm only there because that's where I came from. How do I know it came from there? One book, the Bible. That's it. So the very thing that divides us, do you believe in the Bible? Do you believe it's holy? Do you believe it was written by God? It wasn't by God. It was by writers. How many writers? Was it revised? Was it not revised? Is it misogynistic? Is it this? Is it whatever? The Bible is the uniter. And therefore, every term of reference when you are encountering early Israelihood is biblical by necessity. Because how else do I anchor myself here? I look like a Polish Jew or a Russian Jew. I look like a Lithuanian. I look like whatever. I don't look like the people who are living in the land at the moment. So the one way I can connect to the land is by reclaiming the roots. The roots are biblical. And by the way, the Bedouins remind me of myself when I was a biblical Jew. That's what I was like. That's probably what the tribe of Benjamin looked like, was like Bedouins. They were fighters, they were warriors. They were warriors because they iter yad yamino, meaning they really were ambidextrous. They could stab you with both hands. That's why the Benjamites were good warriors, right? Bedouin. And so it makes sense that we connect that way, but our terms of reference, and as I said, I went to Tzahala. I grew up in Tzahala in a thoroughly secular school where we studied Bible 4 times a week, but of course not religiously, only as literature and history, which is, of course, absurd. Because in the meantime, we also had to learn by heart chapter and verse, and we had to know mi amar le mi matai velama. Who said what to who, when, and why? Okay, well, it's going to stick with you. There it is. So even the ones who are rebelling the loudest, like Amos Kinan, who I will refer to next week, are using the Bible to rebel against. Bialik is using totally religious imagery in order to create a new kind of... They weren't really trying to be secular. What they were trying to be was not galuti, not exilic. And I think that's a better way of understanding it. What they were pushing away was this image of a Jew as a subservient nebuch who can't stand up, who can't speak with a loud voice. That's what they were rejecting. And because that came in the framework of a shtetl and the yeshiva and all of that, okay, so all of that got dumped. Look, I grew up in Israel not hearing a word of Yiddish, certainly not. Yiddish was verboten in my house, okay? My grandfather was a Chassid from Lithuania. He was a Lubavitcher who then went to America, then went to JTS, then came to Eretz Yisrael, didn't even wear a kippah. He said, I'm home. But he remained glad kosher till the day he died, and Shomer Shabbat, and totally religious, except he didn't look it. Why didn't he look it? Because he didn't want that anymore. He wanted Israel. But his Israel? Tevuach artzi v'tehulal mi beit alfa ad nahalal. You know, the language had to be, the imagery had to be biblical. How can you reject the genius of Western world? Even though the Western world keeps claiming that its roots are in Greece and Rome, with all due respect, they're not. The roots are in the Bible, in the Torah. That's where the roots are. Everything comes from there. That it afterwards gets conquered by people, yofi, good for them. And there are, and don't quote anybody that I said the Greeks did a lot of good things, but because, of course, if you were a Jew at the time of the Greeks, they were an enemy, but they were the first anti-Semites. Okay, well, here we have it. What we're trying to do is reclaim something in the only way we know how, and it's always stumbling, it's always funny at times, it's always has some comical effect to it, but it's also beautiful, it's also resonant.
Wonderful, thank you. So let me ask one more, and then I'd like to ask.
Please.
I'm going to ask you for a request.
Sure.
The music is European music. The writers are European writers.
So most of them, except for the two that were Bedouin.
Well, that's the question. So the question is, when they come, you have an aliyah that comes, not just aliyah bet, not just from Eastern Europe, but you have a huge group of Jews who are, first of all, resident in Israel, who are Mizrahim.
Right.
Then you have the onslaught of Moroccan Jews, Iraqi Jews, Egyptian, Tunisians.
Yeah.
And how do they affect the musical culture of Israel?
Oh, what a great question. And in the book that I wrote, The Passion, the Beauty, the Heartbreak, I mention it very specifically and for a very good reason towards the end of the book. Because the Israel in which I grew up in was bigoted. Hand to God, there's nothing I can do about it. Kol Yisrael was not playing Mizrahi music in the main broadcasting time. No prime time Mizrahi music. That happens much, much later. In the early part of the state, you wouldn't know there were Mizrahi Jews in Israel. They were somewhere around the corner, apparently. Now, I knew them. Our housekeeper was from Kurdistan. She was part of the family. We grew up with the kids. We'd go over for smachot and everything. I ate Kurdish food. We did all of that stuff. But the culture was not evident. Here's the irony. What became the official Hebrew pronunciation was done by Moshe Hovav and Reuma Eldar, who used to speak like this, Boker Tov miYerushalayim hasha'a hamesh v'harei ha'hadashot v'ikaran tahila. Okay, what's that accent? It's really Yemenite. Why? Because when the Academy for Hebrew Language looked around, they discovered that the only people who seemed to have kept what Hebrew actually sounded like were Yemenites, where there's a vav and a wav. Because otherwise, why would you have a bet or a vet and a vav? No need for them. Het and chaf, right? tof and tet. All those pronunciations that are so uniquely Yemenite, that became the official sound of Hebrew on the broadcast. And by the way, like my friend who was the great granddaughter of Naftali Herz Imber, she was a radio announcer. She got fined, ducked money from her salary because she mispronounced a word. Okay, so you have that, and at the same time, none of that music, as though it's not there. When was it there? As a kind of a cute, folksy, folkloric kind of taste to give as a counterbalance to the important culture. That was the truth of early Israel. Now, there were songs. There were Bet Shlomim, Filfil Masri. That wasn't his real name, but there were some songs like that. And then, of course, Joe Amar, who came on the scene and was like gigantic because he was such a phenomenal singer and sang. But most of the time, none of that music is affecting the early Israeli writing. There you have it. Later on, yes, starts really in earnest with Pugi, with Kaveret, that who really start introducing that sound into rock and roll, and Beatles with Israeliness, and we'll cover that next session. And then, of course, now, can you imagine after the 80s Israeli music without Mizrahi music? It's unimaginable today. But it was equally unimaginable to have Mizrahi music in the Israel of my early years, up until my 25th year. That's a truth. We sinned. Mea culpa. It's been corrected. It's been corrected big time. But in the early times, in the early days, no, it wasn't evident.
Mm-hmm. Well, this has been a wonderful, wonderful evening. And I'm going to ask your indulgence for just a second because it's been so wonderful. So, it's nighttime and we're all about to go to bed. Sing us a lullaby.
Let's see.
לילה לילה הרוח נושבת, לילה לילה הומה צמרת, לילה לילה כוכב מזמר, נומי נומי כבי את הנר, נומי נומי כבי את הנר, לילה לילה נומי נומי כבי את הנר.
Well, thank you, Donnie, for a wonderful, wonderful evening. And for everyone who's with us tonight, thank you for joining us. Very special thank you again to Lil and Jess for their wonderful support. To Alana Zimmerman, my partner at BBS, and Jackie Singer, our genius on the computer to bring all of this together. So thank you for being with us. A couple of announcements. First of all, please join us next week, Wednesday night at 7:00, and Donnie Massing will continue his conversation about Israeli music and the identity of Israel through its music. So join us again next week. You're welcome to bring friends. We'll put up the Zoom link once again. The recording of this session should be up online in a couple of days as soon as we get it together. And you're welcome to watch that as well. I would really recommend, if you haven't had a chance, if you weren't with us the last 2 weeks, to hear Sagi Raphael's description and lecture on Israeli art and Israeli identity. Also a remarkable, remarkable set of presentations. And they're available on the VBS YouTube page. Please look them up and join us. If you have any trouble finding that, just shoot us an email. We'd love to have you enjoy those presentations. So once again, next week at 7:00, we'd love to have you for our College of Jewish Studies. One more announcement, if you'll let me, before you run. Shabbos, of course, Kabbalat Shabbat. on Friday night at 5 o'clock. Shabbos morning Torah study at 9 o'clock, Rabbi Gelman and me. As well. They're not on YouTube, it says. Where are they? Wherever they are, you'll
They
find.
are, we're working on getting them onto our website.
We'll get them on the website somewhere in the
In a few
universe,
days.
somewhere in
few
the
days.
universe, you will find these recordings. Shabbos, we want to welcome everyone back to Shabbos. We are actually back in person on Shabbat. Believe it or not, COVID has let us come back to have community prayer learning again. And every Shabbos we have musical and learning guests. This Shabbat at VBS starts at 10 o'clock, ends before noon. That's already a mitzvah. And this Shabbat, it'll be Herschel and me will lead services, but we're welcoming Cantor Shira Fox, who is a beautiful, beautiful mistress, master of prayer, who will be with us to lead us in prayer and to sing for us. She is, in fact, the daughter of Herschel and Judy, and a wonderful, wonderful voice in our community. As well, another special guest, we welcome our rabbinic intern, Jared Scott, who will be giving us a little bit of Torah. Jared's our intern this year, and we're delighted to welcome him, a wonderful scholar and a wonderful, joyful soul. So thank you for being with us. And we're really glad that you're here. Donnie, thank you so very, very much. And to everyone,
thank you.
Laila Tov, Numi,
Laila
go to
Tov.
sleep, good night. Think about yourself lying down under the stars next to the Kinneret, smelling the beautiful waves of Eretz Yisrael washing over you. Good night, everyone. Take care.
לילה טוב.
דני,
ביי.
חיבוק מטורונטו.
חיבוק, בני מותק, תודה. אהבה.
Love you.
Love you.
לילה טוב משיקגו.
לילה טוב, Rabbi. Wow.
Rabbi Shlonsky, are you having Torah portion yet on Saturday morning?
Every Shabbos morning, 9 o'clock, I'll be there. This week with Rabbi Gelman, next week with Rabbi Hirsch. So please join us.
And Rabbi Gelman's in Florida. He'll be on Zoom, or he's here.
Always on Zoom. Yeah, we put it on Zoom because that's where you can find God now. God is on Zoom. Did you know that? You just
I
gotta-
got to him on Zoom.
Yeah, you just got to be careful not to
Okay.
mute him.
Yeah.
Or-
Shalom,
Minneapolis
shalom
is here
from Rabbi
too.
Karen Kadar. Shalom from Rabbi Karen Kadar.
Thank
Oh,
you. And hi, Suzanne. Good to see
Hi.
you. Bye, Minneapolis.
Hi,
Bye,
Donnie.
Chicago. Bye, Toronto. Hi, Mitch.
Hi, Donnie.
Rabbi
Hi,
Kadar.
Ed.
And
Hi,
Rabbi Kadar
Veronica.
is retiring
Oh, but she
Oh,
has
hi, Cindy.
so
and
much more to
Herzl.
teach.
to do other misfot.
This is good. This is good. Give her love, please.
Hi, Steve. Bye, guys. Bye, everyone.
Hi.
Kadar Rabbi.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Lila Tov.
Laila Tov.